Hello and welcome to the Here For You podcast. In this podcast we explore topics of psychology, philosophy, mental health and therapy, as well as the intersections between these disciplines. If you'd like to support the show, please visit the Patreon page. The link for this can be found in the show notes of the podcast. Also stick around to the end of the podcast to hear about more details of workshops, different ways you can support, and upcoming shows as well. Have a good listen. This episode of the podcast will be exploring community psychology. So we're going to explore a little bit about what community psychology is. We'll explore what the philosophical assumptions are within this approach. We'll also go on to explore what it is that community psychologists do, the different roles that they may be able to take, both within clinical practice as well as within a research context. And finally, we'll go on to explore how community psychology may be able to influence and help well-being. Okay, so what is community psychology? Okay, so I think before we can really digest or unpack what community psychology is, I think it's probably important to address that psychological approaches take a very wide range of philosophical assumptions, and that these philosophical assumptions that are inherent within different approaches and different psychological models dictate or influence the way that those models build up their ideas of humans and distress, and then also how to work best with those challenges. And this is a very brief summary of different philosophical approaches just to help with our discussion on community psychology today. But definitely worth reading around for anybody who is interested. There's been a lot of writing on this. So we could sort of envision different philosophical assumptions from psychological theories as like a spectrum. So on one end of that spectrum would be positivism, and positivism or positivist approaches take the idea and the philosophical assumption that there is an external reality to the person, and that external reality can be measured in some way. So there's this idea of something like anxiety, and then that exists in the world as a solid construct, and that can be measured in some way. A sort of typical example of a positivist approach would be something like cognitive behavioral therapy. It has a strong positivist stance. On the other end of that spectrum of philosophical assumption would be something like social constructionist. And the social constructionist approach doesn't necessarily think that there is a external reality. And if there is external reality, it questions the ability to measure that in the way that we think we can measure that. A lot of social constructionist theories are kind of in the name, in the idea that they believe that the world and our reality is created and continually recreated through social interactions. A typical example of a psychological theory that would take this philosophical assumption would be something more like systemic family therapy, that would work very much more within the realms of the idea of social construction. And they're almost two ends of an extreme spectrum. Most theories might sort of fit somewhere within the middle of that spectrum in terms of its philosophical assumptions. An example of something that fits more in the middle, probably slightly more towards the social constructionist side, would be critical realism. So it's this idea that critical realism is an idea that there is very possibly a world outside of an individual, that the world there exists outside of just perception, but that we can't really know it. We can't measure it in the way that we think that we are measuring it, or at least has some sort of critical angle about our ability to do such things. Okay, so very broadly speaking, they're the sort of spectrum of philosophical assumptions that psychological approaches make, and typically psychological theories will fall somewhere in between a sort of social constructionist and a positivist stance, as well as individual practitioners and individual thinkers may fall differently on their views within that sort of stance. Okay, and this is just to say that the community psychology approach will typically take quite a social constructionist approach. So on that spectrum between positivism and social constructionism, community psychology will typically find itself more towards the end of a social constructionist approach, with some thinkers being very heavily social constructionist, others probably fitting more within that critical realism realm, but very unlikely to be from a positivist stance. Okay, so with that sort of idea around the philosophical assumptions that are typically made within community psychology, just some ideas about the history of where this concept emerged from and how it kind of came about. So it emerged in the 1950s and the 1960s, primarily within the context of the United States and Western Europe. It emerged as part of a wider community mental health movement within the context, and this sort of wider community mental health movement within the 1950s and 1960s was a process of the shutting down of big asylums, particularly within the United States and the UK and Western Europe. So the shutting down of big asylums with a push towards a treatment of people within the community. So previously, before the 1950s, there might have been these really big asylums, particularly in the UK and America, and the sort of gradual closing down of those big institutions for more of a community-focused model of mental health care. And this was kind of going on in the background and contributed towards the development of community psychology. And at the same sort of time, within the 1950s and 60s, there was a growing interest and understanding of racial and religious prejudice, as well as poverty and other social issues. This further fed into the conception and the creation of community psychology. And community psychology really kind of was birthed out of a development from critiques of traditional psychotherapy. And particularly a critique that psychotherapy is too focused on the individual, and that this actually is detrimental from people who critiqued psychotherapy in the 1950s and 1960s, and started to develop something like community psychology from those critiques. And I think it's really important as well that the term community psychology is somewhat of an umbrella term, and that actually there's probably a lot of different people who are doing quite different things under that umbrella, so engaging in different practices and may not have a lot of agreement possibly between them, even though they might still identify what they're doing as some form of community psychology. Okay, so I guess what is community psychology? We've explored the history, the underlying philosophical assumption. No, I guess it's just a little bit more of a detailed breakdown of what it actually is. So what community psychology aims to do is to understand humans by moving away from a focus on purely the individual, and away from the individual and a focus rather on the integration of social, cultural, economic, political, environmental and international influences to promote positive change, health and empowerment at a systemic level and also an individual level. There's an active participation in social justice within this approach, whereas other approaches to psychology may not emphasize that aspect so much, or even perhaps not see a part for practitioners to have involvement with social justice movements. Community psychology has it as really central to its understanding of how best to help people. Within community psychology, there's real big push of seeing the person in context, and this idea of individuals and people are historically, culturally and socially situated beings who develop within systems and contexts, and therefore we can only understand a person within the context in which they are from. A big contributor to community psychology, and particularly thinking in community psychology, even though they may not have identified themselves as a community psychologist per se, is Bronfenbrenner. So Bronfenbrenner was a thinker, and in the 1970s, 1980s, he came up with something called systems thinking, and it'd be more about systems thinking and Bronfenbrenner within the show description. Okay, so some of the founding principles and competencies within the community psychology movement or community psychology practice. And again, umbrella terms, so there is lots of different practices going on, but something that is probably similar across all of them, or the foundational competencies, the foundational principles of this approach and way of thinking about humanity, is the ability to hold multiple ecological perspectives. So that just means the ability to have perspectives that consider context, that really emphasize the idea of being able to hold multiple contexts. Another sort of foundational principle within community psychology is the idea of collective empowerment, so encouraging not just individual empowerment, but the empowerment of everybody, and that within a collective community context. There's a big emphasis on social, cultural, and cross-cultural competence within practitioners, and a emphasis on community inclusion and partnership. There's a big role for ethical, reflective practice within practitioners. And these sort of really form some of the core backbone of what is held the same across different types of practitioners within the community psychology way of thinking and movement. Okay, so that's a little bit about what community psychology is. I was just thinking about what it is that community psychologists do and what that might actually look like. So, again, with it being an umbrella term, people do different things, but with our podcast today, with our episode today, we're talking a little bit about what's the commonalities between different types of community psychologists. And the commonality is perhaps that it's typically, the aim is typically to engage in things outside of individual psychotherapy. And this can be within a sort of therapy that involves a systems, or something like a sort of family therapy, or something that involves other sort of work systems. But it could also be stuff that doesn't involve any therapy at all, and thinks about practice and engagement at a more sort of community or societal level. There's often a big engagement with research, and particularly research exploring the impact of socio-political systems on health and well-being. The aim is to solve social problems by building collaborative relationships with community members, groups and organisations. So again, that sort of moving things out of just individual psychotherapy more towards collaborative engagement with the aim to solve social problems specifically. And this can typically also take the form of sort of consultation, particularly at organisational or governmental levels. So community psychologists engaging in a sort of consultative role within an organisation, or even within a sort of government level. A big part of what community psychologists do is analyse and formulate wider social systems, and this can be sort of workplaces, families at a lower level than that, communities, as well as governments and nations even to some extent. And largely speaking, community psychologists aim to improve fair and diverse participation. So there's this big emphasis on encouraging and promoting a wide participation within a society, but also wide participation within people's well-being journeys. Okay, so speaking about well-being, how can community psychology contribute and inform the field of mental well-being? So I think we can sort of think about this in at least two different ways, and one of these ways is sort of preventative. So community psychology, within that sort of realm, there is a key focus on preventative interventions. So this may be through enhancing protective factors within communities, as well as promoting and encouraging communities to engage in healthy behaviours. So there can be a preventive element there. There can also be a focus on social issues. So by the addressing of broader social issues such as inequality and discrimination, community psychology helps create environments that promote mental well-being. More equal societies promote better well-being and generally function better all. So I think there's this big focus on something that is actually more preventative rather than reactive, as a lot of other sort of therapy models can be, and a focus on, well, actually what we see is that inequality within society and within nations often leads to greater challenges with mental health and mental well-being. So from a community psychology perspective, there's this idea of, well, if we can help to address some of that stuff on a societal level, perhaps we can look at really bringing up the well-being of everybody involved, and not necessarily just within the context of working with individuals. A metaphor for this type of way of thinking is often the idea of the individual therapist or the individual practitioner, clinician, whatever that is pulling people out of the river. So there's a river and there's people who are drowning, and this person's pulling people out to try and save them. And I think community psychology would see itself as, rather than doing that, they're focused downstream or upstream on what's leading people to get into the river in the first place, and can we stop people ending up in the river and drowning before they need pulled out individually. I think that would be a good metaphor to describe what some of the aim is from a community psychology perspective when it comes to addressing social issues, and the relationship to what it would mean if we address those social issues with a knock-on effect on people's mental well-being. And just to sort of say a little bit more about the role of social inequality on well-being and other aspects of health as well. There's been a lot of research by Wilkinsons and Pickett. They wrote 2 books. One's called The Spirit Level, and more recently The Inner Level, which have detailed in a very comprehensive way a lot of data and a lot of ideas around sort of displaying and showing the role that inequality has on mental well-being. And I think one of their most stark findings across lots of different measures of well-being is that it is actually specifically inequality that leads to the challenges in mental health or decline in mental well-being that we see. How they did this was they collected data that sort of measured it against just poverty, and they found that, well, actually when you measure poverty, you don't see when you measure just how poor a country is, you don't see the challenges or the sort of correlation between poverty and mental well-being as you do when you take a measure of inequality, so sort of income disparity being their measure of inequality, the idea of how much within that society, what's the difference between the sort of poorest denomination and the richest denomination, and the bigger that gap within a society, that indicates poorer mental well-being. So I think that was probably one of the biggest findings of their work, is that idea of actually, no, it isn't poverty that makes people necessarily, or poverty that makes nations worse off in terms of mental well-being, but actually it's the income inequality specifically. Other ways that community psychology may influence or impact upon mental well-being is through engagement, so the encouragement of communities to engage in the process of a support at that sort of social level, but an encouragement for them to engage in possibly post-traumatic growth journeys. Anybody who's interested in finding out more about post-traumatic growth, there's a episode of the podcast I think it's episode 4 of the podcast, which explores that a lot more. And then also, empowerment. We spoke a lot about empowerment in today's episode, of how actually that's a huge focus within the community psychology framework, that it's about sort of empowering communities, and through empowering communities, knock-on effect is that you empower individuals. And that empowerment, the idea of the empowering the communities, that leads to self-efficacy and a sense of control over one's life. Okay, so that's been a sort of whistle-stop tour of what community psychology is, sort of underlying philosophical assumptions, what community psychologists actually do in their different ways, and the sort of relationship between societal inequality and well-being, and then how community psychology aims to address that by addressing possible social issues in particular. So as a very broad conclusion, community psychology aims to understand humans by considering wider social and cultural factors. This represents a move away from an individual focus. Community psychologists engage in research and social action as a way of tackling social issues that affect health. They will typically engage in a more systemic approach to therapy, if they engage in therapy at all. Now, community psychology may inform mental well-being by encouraging collective empowerment, engaging communities, and building preventive strategies. Okay, so that's it for today's episode of the podcast. Thank you for listening, and see you again. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're interested in supporting the show, please do visit the Patreon link in the show description. There's various different packages involved in the Patreon page, right from just supporting the show to further access to additional resources and access to workshops. You can also visit us on the website hereforyoucounselling.com. That's hereforyoucounselling.com. Again, a link within the show description. If you'd like to book onto additional workshops, there's also a link to the Eventbrite page in the show description. There's a variety of in-depth discussions around lots of the topics that we talk about in the show today. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show.